Well, thanks for joining us end of day today. Um, I'm Joe Mullings. I lead the Mullings Group executive search firm. We do a number of things, but executive search is really our primary core competency. And Ajay is president of APAC and a partner of mine here. So just background on us, I've got 35 years in search. Firm's been, we'll probably give you some stats, more than 9,000 successful assignments in medtech. And we have probably done more than 120 build outs of OUS companies coming to the US. So the information we're going to share with you today is very salient on probably the things you don't know and the mistakes you may unintentionally make along the way. And Ajay, your background?
Yeah, sort of an atypical entry into headhunting. I've spent about 21 years in medical device companies. Originally, I'm from the US, had a career there, starting with companies like Ethicon, Medtronic, Eli Lilly, gravitated more so into the commercial P&L side. Worked in the US for about 11 years, started taking on international assignments, starting with Switzerland. Then on, I sort of started my APAC journey. It's been about 14 years now in Asia. And almost all of my big company experience has been P&L and sales leadership. And the last couple of years, I've been working with young medtech, startups, scale-ups, and joined Joe in the Mullings Group 2 years ago. So I run the international, predominantly APAC region of the business.
Yep. And before we get started here, there's two inflection points when you're building an emerging tech company, and I differentiate between emerging tech and startup, and I'll tell you the difference. But there's two major inflection points where you make decisions that could cripple your organization because you make a decision or a series of decisions that don't manifest themselves for 6 to 12 months. And that's putting your clinical trial team on the floor in the US very first, or your commercial go-to-market team on the floor in the US. So most things you can get an immediate feedback from your loop when we start to develop a medical device, because we used to that startup R&D world. But once you make that decision to pick your leader and your original hires in those two functional build-outs is where we end up coming in 90% of the time in a remediation situation, where we have to unpack something. 6 to 9 months have gone through burn rate. And then you have to sort of, esprit de corps gets bombarded, and then you've got to go back out now and do it again the educated way. I'm not saying the right way, but the educated way. So you want to bring us in, Ajay?
Yeah.
And anytime, please stop us, put up your hand. This is not a lecture, it's a workshop. So we'd like you as much interaction, challenging Q&A as possible.
Yeah, so the way we'd like to do this, and just to kind of set up the frame, we'll share some topics, some sort of common areas that we experience working with clients, and then of course we're open to questions, comments, and discussion. We'd like to just start with, one of the common things we see, especially when international companies go to the US, they always go, I know someone, or someone has told me about someone, basically your network connections. Now, that's not a bad thing, and that happens from US to international as well. But I think the real message that we'd like to share from our own experience is the best diligence you can do is to compare that individual to the best in the market, right? I mean, sometimes you're just kind of saying, hey, I know someone who knows someone, I'm going to hire this person. But if you put this individual through the same vetting process as you would somebody from the market, you're actually getting the best buy for your money, right? So your network connections, you really need to kind of vet them to make sure that you're comparing against market experts.
Yeah, and to that point too, and I'll give you some very off the cuff, which I'm notorious for. If somebody's available in the US at the time that you need them, they're probably not that good, right? They're unemployed. They're in between gigs. Usually the best people in the marketplace are already busy solving somebody else's really hard problems. So generally speaking, if you find somebody who happens to be available, the odds are that they're not the best person in the marketplace. You do have those outliers, but I will tell you, after 34 years of doing this, it's a very rare situation that great players are available for your startup for what you want to do at that risk level. Okay.
So Joe's mentioned this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that we specialize in, and also a point of differentiation for us, when you typically work with a lot of recruitment partners or agencies, one of the things, those who have worked with agencies, you'll see that there's a lot of what we call, P&L barriers. So, for example, you may end up working with a recruiting agency in Japan, and you're trying to work with that same firm in the US, and you're handed off to various teams. You have to sort of retell your story. So there's a lot of kind of dissonance in the whole brand building, the competency hiring. One of the things that we are pretty good at, I mean, it's probably one of our points of differentiation and our expertise, is we almost have a fluid P&L approach. Right? You can speak to us. I'm based in APAC. Often I have companies who come to me and say, hey, we're looking to hire in the US, and we sort of fluidly work within the team to kind of make sure that that brand, that company story goes across. And we often manage those searches as well. So, the stats you're seeing here, over 114 build outs. And the key thing here is we're not just always just hiring that one person you've asked us to do. We're building that foundation for the next hires. So really, it's a team build approach as opposed to a transactional.
And we refer to commercial as anything front of the house. So that could be clinical development, clinical trial. Could be your first go-to-market, your market development person, and or your salesperson. So that when we say commercial build-outs, we refer to that as front of the house.
So some strategic foundations for market entry. Joe shared some of this in his talk earlier today, but I think the key message here, and probably again from experience, extrapolating, one of the things that we see a lot in international builds, especially as you come to the US, often structural. So what we have in the last box, they're saying early operational decisions. These are things that are critical to hiring people. And often companies are thinking of this very late in the game. For example, a professional employment organization, i.e., you don't have an entity in the US, or you don't have an entity that can host employees in the US. You don't have an entity location. You haven't figured out your org design. What does your organization in the US look like? If it's a contract manufacturing, you haven't identified who those partners are. A lot of this market, sensitization and readiness to host individuals need to be done ahead of time. And when you start doing it at the very end, often we'll see clients who they've gone through offer stage. Sometimes the offer has been accepted. None of that logistics, none of that structural stuff has been thought out. And especially bringing, hiring people in the US, Americans are a slightly opinionated group. I can say that. They see that onboarding process to be a reflection of company culture. Joe, thoughts?
Yeah, and that's true. Market mapping on salaries is also really important. So usually when organizations will come to us, they'll say we want to hire X, and invariably, I don't know if there's a country that has a higher expectations on compensation than the U.S. So it's always sticker shock, whether it's recently Switzerland, India, Australia, Israel. You usually are way off the mark. You could hire somebody for the money you want to pay, but it's not going to be the person that's going to outperform for you. So the first thing you should do when you get into that U.S. market is your partner should be able to do a market mapping of the talent, what's called avatars of who you would potentially want to hire, the LinkedIn profiles for those people, and their current salary ranges. Now you've got a good bearing on, and I can guarantee you it's not going to map up against what you tell your venture capitalists or your investors on what it's going to cost you to come to market in the U.S. Never happens. So that's what you've got to do first. You've got to do a market mapping survey. And your partner, again, if it's us, fantastic. If it's not, this should be on your to-do list. Will you do a market mapping survey for the top 30 people I should consider for this, their LinkedIn profiles, potentially their resumes, and also what their comp ranges are? Now you'll be able to put an offer out, or at least a package out in the marketplace that will attract the best person in market. And as Ajay mentioned, oftentimes the European and APAC, they want to be on the East Coast for time zone differences most of the time. They usually want to be in Florida, Texas, for whatever reason. They've got to be incorporated. And you've got to have all your answers up front. And we'll go into a couple items later on the comp package and benefits, that if you don't have that established, tightened right up front, and you think you're going to scramble at the end, you're probably going to lose it due to somebody in their mind going home to their sig other. Hey, I'm looking at this job, looking at this opportunity, and it's located out of Singapore, but I'm going to be the first U.S. You know what their question is? The sig others is insurance, benefits, how you're going to get reimbursed for your credit card every month, travel, etc. And if you don't have those answers, there's doubt that's going to infiltrate that person's mind. So you've got to have all that done beforehand.
So yeah, just building on what Joe said, right? Oftentimes what we see with clients who are looking to hire their very, very first individuals in the US often seem to only think through base salary and bonus as kind of the two levers. But really building on what Joe has said, depending on where you're pulling those individuals from, if they're leadership roles, there are corporate performance bonuses. If you're in commercial roles, field individuals, often as people are walking off a base commission type of structure in a territory that they've built over time, now you're asking somebody to step off and create and take risk. The first year guarantee is extremely important, or some sort of step off mechanism where reps feel comfortable the time it takes to build your business, they have that soft landing. Commissions, capped and uncapped. This is something important to kind of really understand. In the US, if someone's coming from a comfortable base bonus commission type of structure, they're very excited to come into an uncapped scenario. But people have to really understand what that means on both sides of the fence, right? Stock options, 401k. I think I'll summarize this as, don't make benefits an afterthought. And don't make the frills an afterthought, because these are negotiating levers for top talent.
Yeah, and one of the items on there, 401k, is really important because in the U.S., it's a little bit of a retirement mechanism, and nearly every executive will take advantage of that, and they will absolutely tap that onto the back end of the salary expectations. While I'm leaving about $22,000 on the table on that, that math is always going to come through on the back end of that. And per AJ's point, the first year guarantee. So if you're let's call it a commercial person who is actually developing a market for you. And depending on the sales cycle of your product, so obviously that's going to matter too. So if you're selling a 9-month sales cycle, you've got to make sure that you're offering a 12-month guarantee on salary. And that's tough. And that's got to be in your business plan to your investors up front, because you don't want to have to go back and have to sort of propose that at the 11th hour, which then stretches out the process. So that guarantee is very, very important. And you've got to generally match where, again, on the sales side, where that salesperson is. And most of the time, depending on what you're selling at a VP level, and we'll talk about that. We didn't go into titles actually in this presentation. If you want to hire a VP, hire a director. If you want to hire a chief revenue officer, hire a VP. Few reasons, but two primary reasons is the lower you go, the harder they're going to work and grind it out. And if somebody is insisting on having a VP title, you can let them earn it and tell them you're not going to hire a VP in their place unless they don't execute. Second, they're going to go and they're going to look at comp levels in the US. A VP of sales is going to probably make 20 to 25% more than a director. So they're going to look for a comp package relative to the title they're coming into. And generally, an emerging tech company or a startup company, you need somebody who's going to be a player coach all the time. First in the market, you don't need an executive, so to speak. And I mean that almost in a derogatory statement. You need somebody who's going to do something. So what you need is a hardcore player coach who's going to be out there and be your number one salesperson, or your number one driving your clinical trials on site selection, patient recruitment, and doing all of the field work, if you will, that typically they wouldn't want to do. And you want to scare the people that way as well. Let's pause for a second. Any questions in any of that so far? Challenges? Further information? Okay. I opened up with this one because this is the one that gets everybody's attention. These are the inflection points of success or failure most of the time. Your clinical trial hire, the team, or the sales team, because you don't get a clear signal for 6 to 12 months. So, I got this one in the wrong order because you got to get it more right than wrong. You'll never get it perfect, but you want to at least get it directionally, on the target.
So this is an area that I'm very, very passionate about, but also because I've lived and worked in multiple countries, I've hired in multiple countries, and now I get to do it on the recruitment side. And I often see not just my own experiences projected on others, but I often see clients going through the struggles as well, and hired individuals as well. I mean, it goes both ways, right? So we've just highlighted a few things to think about. The premise is the company's founding culture is your home culture. As you're expanding to other countries, you now need to think about that culture as well, relative to yours, right? Often we'll have clients who, countries like India, China, Australia, even Australia, like you think, oh, we both speak English, sort of. But Australians, they'll come to the US and they'll go, whoa, Americans are really aggressive and they really want these decisions made super fast. So you've got to have that acuity. You've got to have that awareness of what's our culture and what's the culture of the individuals that we're trying to bring on board, especially when you're building the first teams, because that's your foundational culture in that new country, right? So just to highlight some, speed to decisions. This is just for your own thought process and provocation. But U.S. speed to decisions are a lot quicker, and especially on commercial levels, they want answers quick. And so top management needs to be able to respond to those things. And by the way, as Joe's alluded to earlier, this begins right at the interview process, right? It's because I can tell you, individuals who are going through the interview process, when they see slow speed to decisions, that reflects a lot on, okay, is this how it's going to be all the time? So speed to decision is something that you need to think about on both sides of the pond. Communication styles. Some cultures are a lot direct versus other cultures tend to be more circular, right? And so, again, a big consideration for U.S. hiring is how individuals in the U.S. will communicate. And by the way, this is different within regions in the U.S., right? Those of you who work and live in the U.S. know what I'm talking about. East Coasters versus West Coasters. He's an East Coaster. I'm a West Coaster. So, we can dial it up and dial it down, but there are different communication styles. Joe, you mind if I run through?
Yeah, please do.
Individualistic versus collectivistic. Now, in Asia, you'll deal with a lot of collectivistic culture, right? A lot of this is what the team wants. We really need to kind of think collectively. Even in Australia, there is a phrase that's called the tall poppy syndrome, right? You don't want to be the individual that sticks out and wants everything. Now, in the US, culturally, sometimes that's rewarded. You are the driver, you're the entrepreneur, you're the guy, guy or gal setting up the business. So you really have to think through, of the people you hire, what are the types of culture? And you got to permeate that into the culture of the company as you're trying to set up these teams. Pace, I think we can kind of allude to it. And hierarchy. I mean, in Asia, hierarchy equals tenure, equals achievements, promotions, etc. In countries like the US, it's real metrics, it's performance, it's what you've set up. Sometimes it's on a quarterly basis or a yearly basis is what people are reacting to. So we've just put this up here in terms of home culture versus what we call hiring culture to be thoughtful about the things that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and I take this a step further. And again, I'm from New York, and as AJ inferred, I'm a little more forward than most people, but it's based on experience. And he talked about regions. So I do a lot of work with Israel, and my Israeli founders all the time will always worry about, can this person deal with an Israeli culture and the demands required and the communication style and the forwardness and the ability to have a very animated discussion and still hug each other when it's over. Where if you take somebody from New York to do that, you're going to misinterpret that as disrespectful. But in certain cultures, the behavior you have to accommodate. Is the person you're hiring in the U.S., and you need somebody to keep you honest, is the person you're hiring in the U.S. going to be tolerable of our culture and be able to communicate with it? Because if you don't match that, I'm not looking for you to match the US culture. I'm looking for you to select your first 3 to 5 people that will be able to deal with your culture. So when I hire for a French startup, I need a very specific culture there. Israeli startup, very specific culture. India startup, very specific culture. Even the UK, believe it or not, very specific culture. And if you get that wrong, you have this quiet dissonance that starts. You'll start to see communication drop off. You'll start to see lack of performance, but you'll see it way too late because you're not there looking at it. So I strongly recommend that you bring a third party in to be the conscience that stands between the culture that you have that started this company that still is going to come into the US, and these first 3 to 5 people are going to be your change agents that is going to allow both cultures to outperform together. But if you don't get it right in those first couple, that gets spread and almost side chatter that is going to create an us versus them. And it happens all the time in every single US company I've ever brought to OUS company I brought to the US. So you need somebody in the middle there who's going to challenge you in that area, because too many times you're just like, yeah, they'll be fine. We went out to dinner with them. They seem like they could fit us. And that's where a big miss occurs. Okay.
I'll just add maybe two quick points. One is, some cultures start with price or salary first. And when you hire in the US, that is not a good practice when you start talking to people. And it happens, right? People will start interview conversations with, hey, how are you? How much do you make? Or they'll say, this is our budget for the role. Right away, you've disenfranchised the individual you're speaking to, right? Versus hey, I want to get to know you. What have you done? Tell me about your accomplishments. Tell me where your compensation is at right now. I mean, it's a much more sort of looser or passiver way of kind of asking those kinds of questions, right? And the second comment I wanted to make is, especially with hiring in the US, from an international perspective, US employees, especially, those who have been successful, very much subscribe to a do what you say mentality. And as you're an international client, you're kind of coming into the market, especially when you have type A commercial individuals. If you say you're going to do something, i.e. launch a product, you're going to invest in the country, you're going to grow the team, you're promising someone a next metric increment at some point, you have to deliver these sorts of things, right? Because with that remoteness, with the distance from you hiring to where home office is, to Joe's point, more of that dissonance that's created from you're not delivering on your promises. When your employees remote start going quiet, they're shopping for jobs, right? So these are just some things to think about with a global sort of perspective.
Yeah. Yuval?
I think you're very correct about saying that you have to have a bridge closer between the phone company and the local company management, right? Or it doesn't work. Thank you very much. But you also have to add the point that you have to do it on the board of directors. And that's a very critical issue, because board of directors, they don't understand the other culture, bring the company or bring the joint venture, whatever structure it is, into trouble. So my advice to, if I may, to whoever want to do this kind of building companies or move or building bridges towards towards the US, a priori, to create a mixed board. So in the board of directors, there'll be half of the local and half of let's call it the target country, in this case US, because without the board being synchronized with this, everything you did won't work.
Yeah, and Yuval brings up a really good point. I mean, in a perfect world, if you have one country having half the board of directors and the other, that's a dream world. But if you're interviewing for a job, you're first in country, I don't care what country it is, if you want to see, is this your first entity or your investor's first entity in that region? because they're just not going to understand the small nuances that are going to matter in that region. So, this is more about you hiring, but if you're interviewing, you want to find out, is this your first entity ever in this? And tell me about that. Right. And then you want to also interview the board, and the board should also be expected to be interviewed by that person, not them interviewing the person. Right. That's really, really important, because you want that person to be successful. So thank you, Val, for that. That's really important.
Just any thoughts, given that probably a few of us like me are coming into the US with rather limited resources, shall we say, as a startup, thoughts on geographic coverage when it comes to spanning what is an enormous country geographically and also, population distribution wise? Any thoughts in terms of establishing commercial presence?
Yeah, so it really matters. I'll answer that first, and then AJ can chime in. It matters what the therapy is and what the function is, right? So if I'm doing orthopedics, I may want to be down in Florida, right? If I'm doing total knees or something like that. If I'm doing something in the vasculature, I may want to be in the heart attack belt, right? Alabama or Louisiana, those areas. I definitely want East Coast because, again, depending on where we are, it depends on, and then when you heat map the talent in the U.S. medical device, but if you're commercial sales, it doesn't matter that much because nearly all your commercial salespeople are remote, right? So if we're going to keep this to the commercial end, I would really index around nearest airport, what therapy you're selling, where are your call points. If you're running clinical trials, obviously you want the person near those clinical trials. And I'll say this, and I've said it in public domain, I would never hire a West Coaster. They don't work hard enough, right? They spend way too much time doing soft things. I would hire an East Coast person or a Northeast person. Soft things, hacky sack and pizza parties and walking their dogs and wall climbing and
Whoa.
surfing. Yeah. But I would hire an East Coast person. That's it.
Unless you go so far west, you're in Australia, then you're all right. You're almost an East Coaster.
But culturally too, if you get people in New England, they're going to work harder than people in the Bay Area. They just do. They might not be smarter, but they're going to work harder. So some of that region, I'm just going to tell you the truth. I mean, this is after 9,000 placements and probably 9,000 I missed. That's the way that the workforce is.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll just go back to just
Denying it.
You can't deny it.
I left. It really goes back to mapping, right? Like you've got I would say there's, to Joe's earlier point, there's two inflection points, the clinical, the commercial. And a lot of times we work with clients who are moving into clinical stage, so pivotal studies, and they already have a sense of where are they doing clinical trials at. So if they're at the clinical stage, we're looking at people who can cover those trials and cover those studies. But when it comes to commercial, we have much more leeway because we know individuals can cover large territories. But again, we're looking at density. We're looking at mapping. We're trying to figure out where the most procedures are. Often we're looking at who are the right KOLs that need that kind of coverage, right? So you take all these factors in, and it really goes back to if you're working with a partner who understands these elements, they'll do that with you. They're going to share and align your data with you, going, what do you know about the region? And here are our thoughts of the region. Here's where we think you should hire people. So it's a partnered effort.
Yeah. Next one, Paige? Or is that the last one?
That is the last slide. Yes.
Okay.
Question. So I'm CEO of a Singapore startup, and I understand the U.S. and market dynamics fairly well in the vascular space. And I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts. For a foreign startup coming to the U.S., if you you've got a team, you've been working on your technology for the last 5 to 10 years, you devoted your every waking moment of your life to it, and then there's the perspective from the any investor that's trying to fund your move to the United States in order to enter the U.S. market is, hey, if I'm going to invest $30-40 million for you to launch a product in the U.S., I really rather have a U.S.-centric team, or somebody who's been in one of the big corporates, Boston Scientific, Abbott, and so forth, in order to lead the team. This is a sort of a, there's a tension there, right, between the original founding team and then the team that maybe the investors need to see to really, really launch. How have you seen this dynamic play out, and any advice and thoughts?
Yeah, it's a complex question, and look, OUS companies love headlines, and hiring out of a strategic is hiring a headline, and it's not necessarily hiring a doer. Generally, when you're at one of the large strategics, you want to know what great looks like, but then you want somebody who's moved to an emerging tech startup and has lived that world, because you don't want that first dose of reality at your expense if you're a startup. So that's number one. Number two, it's a point AJ and I didn't touch on, but I'm glad you brought it up. One of the most challenging parts is you have your startup team in Singapore and Israel, wherever it is, and that's their baby. And now they send that baby overseas, especially the engineers. And now that baby's overseas. And what do engineers not want to be told? That their baby's ugly. And so when you send that baby overseas and you have to adjust that technology because you're learning in the market there, it comes back. That's where that US person needs to have that other person in the home country, that they talk together first. You need to have that intermediary. If you allow that US person, no matter how gifted they are, to talk directly back to the non-interpreter, you're going to end up having these layers and layers of dissonance occur over time. So I didn't want that to go by. But I don't think I would hire, if I was coming OUS to the US, I would not be hiring headlines. I would not be hiring pedigree. I would be hiring somebody who proved that they could take a product and start at the bottom of the office building and work their way up to the top of the office building in that therapeutic specialty, knows the KOLs. They may not be the prettiest person, but they will act, because that's not going to be the person that takes you to your acquisition most likely either. Keep that in mind. You're going to trade out that lead commercial person by the time you start to get from 0 to 10 million. That's the hardest pathway. 0 to 10 million on that early adoption. Once you get the flywheel going, you may look at something different, which is why I said earlier, hire a director. A director still knows how to work, and a director out of a startup who understands that therapy. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah. And all I was going to add is those first 2 to 3 years of your presence in that country, assuming the US, is so critical that if you're bringing someone who's already a headliner or a C-level or let's say a VP level, they're looking for their first CEO gig. So they're using this opportunity as a launch pad, right? And that's not the right commitment you want in someone in that first role.
Yeah. You don't want their first dose of adversity at your expense. I think I could probably count less than 5 CEOs that I've taken from a large strategic down to a startup, which is our primary business, that were successful. That's a very small number. That they're greatly skilled, but not at what's required hand-to-hand combat every single day. It just doesn't happen very often. So we've got just a couple minutes left. Any other questions on that? Outlier questions? Anything at all? Yuval?
That you have to take into account as a phone company trying to go to the United States. What's the purpose? Why they go? They may don't need a company. They may need a distributor if it's only for distribution. So that's another type of person you want to hire. You may want to move the whole company in the future to the US to make the headquarters another totally different qualification. So I would say before even you move, you have to think why you want to do it. What's your purpose? And based on this, you can select the right person. And I think that has to be emphasized to whoever tried to go there.
And that's a great point. As AJ mentioned, our initial intake call with our clients talks nothing about the position. It usually talks about, another question here, you can ask them for the mic. The initial intake call is tell me about what you're trying to get done, right? People hire people to solve problems. So we want to understand, why are you coming here? Why do you think you have to come here? What is your goal? What do those deliverables look like in the first 12 months? And odds are you probably need some major readjustment. And it's not out of the ordinary for somebody to want to come in, they'll meet with us, and they'll say, oh shit, let us get back to you. And 6 months later, they'll come back to us and say, okay, we're ready to go now. And they're adjusted. So that's a really good point as well.
There's a flip side to that as well, right? I mean, we represent clients and we need to know the why. We absolutely need to know the why. But at the same time, the individuals we're screening and vetting for you, we need to know their why, right? So the more we know about why you're coming to the US, what's your purpose, what are you trying to achieve, fundamentally, what are you looking to build? What's the culture? What are you looking for in this person? We then extremely vet the individuals who we're presenting to go, why are you coming to this role, right? Is this a paycheck? Is this a next bump? Or what's the underlying passion? So it goes both ways for us to try and vet that.
Do you have any thoughts on equity and options, stock options in particular, relative to, experience and hierarchy in terms of the role versus stage and size of the startup? Just any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, want to go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think depending on where you're at in the stage of your company, and as you're bringing individuals to what are ascension roles, equity always makes it attractive, but we also try to vet what stage and what individual you're trying to bring into the company. For example, if you're bringing a senior manager or a senior director, sometimes those individuals, if they're coming from commercial businesses, may not understand the equity story. However, if you've got someone who's done a commercial leadership role in a startup, they understand the value of that equity. So I think, yes, on both sides. We talk on the client side, say, give us a sense of what are all of the options that you are willing to present and how is it measured is also important, right? Because when we talk to individuals, we inevitably get asked, what's the vesting period? What's the value? What are the milestones? Things like that. So we try to really understand that story, but at the same time, we're trying to present it to the right people so that it actually sticks. Because if you're bringing in the wrong person who doesn't understand that kind of metric, honestly, there's no stickiness factor there.
Yeah, and the equity is just one of the levers that we talk about, right? There's multiple levers when people make a career decision. One is cash, one is equity, one is title, one is role, responsibility, influence, etc. So there's a number of levers in there. We're also quite candid with people, and I always tell people, I said, listen, the odds of you cashing in on this, a meaningful sort of economic opportunity in your lifetime is remote if you statistically look at it. So you need to be looking at this from a career development perspective. And you need to be looking at this as cash compensation on an annual basis. And if there's a transaction that occurs during the time that you're there, fantastic. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask for equity. And I say that to the client too, because the clients too many times say, I know market for this position is $250 on a base and $200 in a bonus, but we want somebody who's interested in building something, right? And it's a fair statement, but they're not in love with your company yet. You are, right? And that gets lost sometimes. It's like, you can't ask me to love your company day one and have me bet my standard of living on that. So, you can go around this room, anybody who's been in a startup here. How many of you cash a check larger than 7 figures? There you go. Okay. So while the equity is important, it's not something that we ask people, which is why we have a premier name in the business. It's not something that we ask people to bet on. It's a mindset. Equity represents a mindset and the type of people you're going to go to work for. Equity represents people who are wing walkers and people who will take chances. That's what it represents. It doesn't represent somebody who's chasing money. It represents a culture and a maniacal drive that they're going to wake up every day and ride their bicycle, drive their car, and chew off their left arm for this vision. And if I happen to cash a check, all the better. But that's what we like about the equity bet. Nobody's ever cashed a check in this room that's been meaningful, and that's just a good sampling size. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.